This week, in wrestling history, we go back 37 years ago. This week on July 14th, 1984, what would come to be known as Black Saturday took place. Now just imagine, picture it for a moment here, just imagine being a huge fan of NWA wrestling, watching faithfully on TBS every Saturday at 6:05. When suddenly one week you turn on the show and instead of seeing Gordon Solie's face, you see Vince McMahon hosting the show, throwing it to footage of his WWF matches. You probably would not be very happy about that. The Briscoe brothers, Jerry and Jack, they played a big role in all of this. Vince McMahon was looking to expand his presence nationally, beyond his slot on the USA Network. And Georgia Championship Wrestling was the only other promotion with a national cable slot. And McMahon had made an offer to Ted Turner for the slot previously, and Turner had rejected him. And it wasn't long after that, Vince got wind of all the turmoil behind the scenes that was going on. GCW had multiple stakeholders. Ole Anderson had a minor stake in it, and he was also serving as the head booker. And the other owners were not very happy with some of the things and the decisions that Ole was making. So Vince McMahon approached those other owners, which included the Briscoes. They and Jim Barnett all agreed to sell their stakes to Vince McMahon for some $900,000, which gave him controlling interest, about 90%, and there was nothing Ole could do about it. They went behind Ole's back and they did this. That gave McMahon access to the Saturday time slot on TBS. And the complaints came in fast and furious from angry viewers. They sent in thousands of phone calls and letters. They did not like the WWF style of wrestling. It ran counter to what they loved about the NWA. And they loved Gordon Solie, and they wanted him back as well. In response, Turner made deals to air Mid-South Wrestling and other Southern wrestling programs and other slots that trounced the Saturday show in the ratings. Vince responded the only way he knows how. He tried to stick it to them by airing primarily reruns of matches that had already aired either on USA Network or on their syndicated shows, which is not what was promised when he made the deal. There were supposed to be matches airing from the studios at TBS. The whole thing was a disaster, financially and otherwise. Vince McMahon ended up selling the time slot to Jim Crockett Jr. for $1 million. Famous story, he allegedly told him, "I'm going to make you choke on that million." Jerry Briscoe admits that Vince brought Gorilla Monsoon with him to the studio that first day just in case things went sideways. He was kind of walking into the lion's den. He didn't know what he was walking into. So he brought the gorilla with him as his bodyguard. But Briscoe got a job with Vince out of it for 36 years before he got released last year. 33 years ago this week on July 16th, 1988, Bruiser Brody was fatally stabbed in a shower stall in a locker room in Bayamon, Puerto Rico, though he did not die from his injuries until early the next morning. The incident took place on the 16th. He was 42 years old. One of wrestling's great tragedies, that this man, one of the most famous performers in the business at that time, he may not have been friendly to all promoters. He had a reputation for being a little difficult to work with, depending on who he worked for, but well-respected, very successful. Like I said, one of the biggest names in the business who I think it was inevitable at some point would have gone on to work for Vince McMahon. Would it have worked out? Who knows? Because Brody was known, if he was working somewhere and things weren't going the way that he wanted it to go, he would pack his shit and leave. But that's always been one of those what-if questions. What if Brody had gone to New York? What if Brody had gone to work for Vince in the late 80s and worked a program with Hogan? Well, I mean, if he did, I think we all know how that would have ended. It would have ended like every other Hogan program would have ended. But we'll never know. But one of the great tragedies is that you have this man and he is laying there on the floor in the locker room, bleeding out and dying. And the bastard got away with it. I've talked about the Brody murder in great detail. I also covered the Dark Side of the Ring episode, so I won't get into all of it again. You can go back and find those episodes. But it took almost an hour for the ambulance to even get to the building. Tony Atlas was there. He saw Jose Gonzalez, Invader #1, holding the bloody knife in his hand. Atlas then had to carry Brody because he was such a big man. He carried him to the ambulance. According to Dutch Mantell, who was there that night at the show, Brody underwent 2 operations. It was during the second one that he bled to death on the operating table. He believes that if he was treated in an American hospital, he would have had a much better chance of surviving. Gonzalez was initially charged with first-degree murder, but that was downgraded to involuntary homicide. And he was later acquitted by a majority vote. So, their judicial system over there, at least at that time in Puerto Rico, is quite different than it is here in the States. There was no jury trial or anything like that. But he was acquitted. And Gonzalez was part owner of the World Wrestling Council in Puerto Rico at that time. Carlos Colon was the principal owner. A lot of people believe that Colon had a hand, if not in plotting the murder itself, then at least helping to cover it up. The murder weapon also mysteriously vanished. It was never recovered. And Mantell and Atlas have talked about, and maybe others have talked about waiting for summonses to be sent to them so that they can come back to Puerto Rico and testify at Gonzalez's trial, because they talked to the police. Atlas talked to the police and gave his account of things, what he saw. He was just waiting to get a summons, and he was going to go and testify. And, I mean, maybe some people wouldn't have because they would have been afraid to. But the point is, for all this waiting for a summons, they didn't come until after the trial had already been completed. Then they arrived in the mail. Meanwhile, the trial was over. Imagine that. Fuck Jose Gonzalez and fuck Carlos Colon. I left my seat to go take a piss when WWE inducted him into the Hall of Fame in 2014. 31 years ago this week, on July 16th, 1990, WWE taped its 27th edition of Saturday Night's Main Event, dubbed Wild Kingdom, from Omaha, Nebraska, which aired on NBC on July 28th. This show set the stage for the double main event at SummerSlam the following month, with the Ultimate Warrior defending the WWE Championship against Ravishing Rick Rude, and Hulk Hogan making his return to challenge Earthquake to a match. Bobby Heenan interfered in the Rude match, which opened the show, leading to a disqualification, and the two would meet again for the title in a steel cage at SummerSlam. While on this show, Vince McMahon introduced Hulk Hogan for his first appearance since he was squashed, literally squashed, by Earthquake on the Brother Love show months earlier. You have got to see this Hogan tribute video they aired before he came out. It was quite the tearjerker. This was to Hogan what Tell Me a Lie, what that video was years later to Shawn Michaels. Earthquake and Dino Bravo came out after Hogan's promo to attack. They surrounded him. They surrounded the ring. But Tugboat ran down to save the Hulkster. This is when they were trying to give Tugboat a push by associating him with Hogan. He was a friend of Hogan's. He ended up not even being in Hogan's corner at SummerSlam. They wrote him off in an injury angle on TV, and they put the big boss man with Hogan instead. The boss man was much more over than Tugboat was anyway. Demolition beat the Rockers, which led to the Hart Foundation coming out and trying to tell the referee that the illegal member of Demolition got the pinfall. This is when Smash and Crush were tagging together with Axe in their corner. This then brought out the Legion of Doom to do the same thing. And what a visual this was. I watched this back. This brought a smile to my face. This scene right here is tag team wrestling for me. We had Demolition, we had the Rockers, we had the Hart Foundation, we had LOD, all in and around the ring at the same time. If this had happened years later, we would have gotten a Fatal 4-Way at SummerSlam that year. But they didn't do Fatal 4-Ways back then. We didn't have Fatal 4-Ways, we didn't have Triple Threats, we didn't have any of this stuff. There was no Money in the Bank cash-ins. You had to earn your way to a championship match. So we never did get that Fatal 4-Way. Mr. Perfect retained his Intercontinental title over Tito Santana. This was a fabulous match. This is one of my favorite matches ever on Saturday Night's Main Event. The near falls in this match had everybody convinced that Tito was winning the belt. This was so great. This match is a lost gem that does not get talked about enough. 4-star match. If you've never seen it, it's worth seeking out this episode just to watch that match. And we had the debut of the Texas Tornado, Kerry Von Erich with a win over Playboy Buddy Rose. This was one of my favorite editions of Saturday night's main event, and sadly, the final one with Jesse the Body Ventura and Vince McMahon together on commentary, because Jesse would be fired the following month after a dispute with McMahon over a video game. Jesse had a standing offer to do a video game, which he did end up doing. It was a game based around his likeness. I believe the issue may have been that it was a Sega game, and WWE had an existing deal with Nintendo at that time. But whatever it was around that game. It led to a bigger rift between the two. Jesse made it very clear that you don't own me. And that was the end of Jesse Ventura in WWE. He sued them in court the following year over royalty payments that he felt he was owed, and he won. The first person, maybe the only person ever, to take Vince McMahon to court and win. 30 years ago this week, on July 14th, 1991, WCW put on one of the worst pay-per-views in wrestling history with the Great American Bash from Baltimore. It was to have been Ric Flair defending his WCW World Heavyweight Championship against Lex Luger inside a steel cage. But all of the drama that I documented previously went down between Flair and Jim Herd, and Flair quit the promotion, or he was fired, depending on who you believe. And he took the big gold belt with him. Instead, Luger won the vacant title from Barry Windham in a cage, while fans chanted, "We want Flair." Some fans walked out. This show was a disaster, not just for that reason, but just up and down the card. Terrible match after terrible match. Kevin Nash was playing the Oz character at that time here after Turner had acquired the rights to the Wizard of Oz, but he suffered his first loss to Ron Simmons, and that was the end of the Oz character. After that, Nash says that if it wasn't for Dusty Rhodes and that Oz gimmick, he never would have made it in the business. As bad as it was in the States, he said that gimmick got over huge in Japan, and it helped him, in his words, find his way. Yeah, well, maybe so, but it still sucked. Main event was to have been a mixed tag team match with Rick Steiner and Missy Hyatt taking on Arn Anderson and Paul E. Dangerously, also in a cage. Instead, it turned into a handicap match when Dick Murdoch and Dick Slater came out before the match and kidnapped Missy Hyatt. Against her will, they kidnapped this poor woman. They took her to the back. There was a fan in the aisleway as they're carrying her away from the ring who took a swing at Murdoch. And I don't know why you would want to take a swing at Dick Murdoch, but this guy took a swing at him. And Murdoch dropped Missy when he let go of her to go take a swing at the guy, who's very lucky that he whiffed, or else he would have been out cold. Steiner gave Arn Anderson a Steiner line. He did the same to Paul Heyman to win the match in 2 minutes. It was over. What happened is that the Maryland State Athletic Commission had, and I believe still to this day has, a rule on the books prohibiting male against female matches. WWE they were aware of this rule when they booked Vince McMahon to wrestle his daughter at No Mercy back in 2003. They just paid the fine in advance so they could do the match. Because that's all the commission cares about. As long as they get paid, that's all that matters. WCW either didn't know about the rule or they didn't give a shit and they advertised the match anyway. Either scenario is plausible. 29 years ago this week, on July 12th, 1992, WCW presented its Great American Bash pay-per-view from Albany, Georgia. The final Great American Bash until 1995, highlighted by an excellent match between Sting and Vader for the WCW World Championship. This was Vader's first WCW title win. Sting hit his head on the metal bar that connects the top turnbuckle to the ring post on a Stinger splash in the corner. And a short time later, Vader hit a powerbomb and stacked him for the win. I loved the matches that Sting and Vader had. They worked so well together. Whether it was this one, their King of Cable match at Starrcade, their White Castle of Fear strap match at Super Brawl the following year. You know, everybody talks about the Flair Steamboat trilogy. But the Sting Vader trilogy deserves a mention too. I'm not saying it's better than Flair Steamboat, but it definitely deserves a mention. But Vader would not have the title for long. He dropped it just 3 weeks later to Ron Simmons. There was some controversy locally. They had 8,000 fans packed into the Civic Center for the show, only half of which were paid. The other half were freebies in the form of coupons, and they gave away so many of them that they had to turn a lot of people away, some of whom had been waiting outside the venue since 9 o'clock in the morning, only to be sent home. Situation was bad enough that it made the local news. So they basically did what the airlines do. They overbooked. They overbooked and they fucked over a whole bunch of people. 27 years ago this week, on July 17th, 1994, at the Bash at the Beach pay-per-view, Hulk Hogan made his in-ring debut for World Championship Wrestling. This was after the big ticker tape parade in Orlando that he got the month prior. This was also the first ever nationally televised match between Hulk Hogan and Ric Flair. There was at least one Hogan-Flair match that aired on television. It was locally on MSG Network in late 91 in WWE. But never did the two of them have a singles match one-on-one that aired on television or on pay-per-view on a national basis. As crazy as that sounds, given that Flair was in WWE for a good year and a half. The match was, teased for WrestleMania 8, although never actually planned. It's still, one of those matches that didn't happen but should have at that time, but it happened in WCW, and it went exactly the way you would have expected it to go. Hogan and Flair, they worked what was actually a pretty good match, but of course Hogan no-sold a lot of his shit. He won with the big leg. He became the new champion. This was also the last of Jesse Ventura in WCW. He had been doing announcing for them since '92. I don't think it is a coincidence that Jesse's run here ended when Hogan came into the company. Hogan and Jesse had always been friends. They'd always gotten along, but it was years later in a deposition when Ventura learned that Hogan was the one who ratted him out when he tried to get the boys together and unionize back in '86. Ventura didn't know that it was Hogan who ratted him out until he had his lawyer ask Vince McMahon about it under oath in a deposition about something completely unrelated. But he goes, hey, go ahead and ask McMahon about this other thing. Because he had always wondered, how is it that Vince found out that I had given this speech in the locker room that night? There was nobody else around. The agents weren't there. Vince wasn't there. How did he find out? Because Vince called up Ventura and threatened to fire him and yelled at him when he found out what he had tried to do. This was right before WrestleMania 2. So once he had Vince in a deposition about the royalty stuff, he told his lawyer, look, ask him this other question. That's when Vince said, without even batting an eye, he goes, oh, because Hogan told me. He said, Hogan told me. Hogan told me what Jesse had done. From that point on, there was no love lost. Ventura had no love lost for Hogan. In fact, he was calling some of the action, I think, on the show. He was working the show, but he did not work the main event. He did not work Hogan's match. So again, I don't think that was a coincidence. I don't think that was by accident. But Hogan has, he had compiled over the years quite the record for himself at Bash at the Beach. He competed in 5 out of the 7 main events on these Bash at the Beach shows. He won the championship here in his very first one from Ric Flair in '94. He successfully defended the title against Vader in a cage the following year. In '96, he showed up, he turned heel, he helped form the New World Order. He tagged with Dennis Rodman in the main event in '97 and again in '98. And then in 2000, it wasn't the main event, but he won the world title from Jeff Jarrett with the whole Russo work-shoot thing that went on. Then it was nullified and he left the company. Hogan never came back. I would say that it is fair to call Hulk Hogan Mr. Bash at the Beach. We kind of assign these titles to people. Shawn Michaels, Mr. WrestleMania. For years, I've said Bret Hart is Mr. SummerSlam. Randy Orton, I once said Randy Orton is Mr. Survivor Series, and John Cena was Mr. Royal Rumble. When you look at the success that these guys have had on these shows, Hulk Hogan was Mr. Bash at the Beach. 3 days earlier, 3 days before this, before he won his first WCW championship, Hogan was in a courtroom in Long Island, New York, testifying under immunity from prosecution at the Vince McMahon steroid trial. He said that he would call Vince's secretary to place orders for him with Dr. Zahorian, and that when his roids would arrive at Titan Tower, he would pick them up with his paycheck and his fan mail. I can just picture it now, Hogan strolling into the office. "You got my check? Here you go, Terry. You got my fan letters from all my Hulkamaniacs? Here you go. You got a stack of mail right here. You got my steroids? You got my candy? You got my syringes? Yeah, they're in that brown bag right over there. You just pick everything up all at once. How convenient." It doesn't get any more convenient than that. He claimed he took anabolic steroids not only for bodybuilding purposes, but to heal injuries, and that he no longer uses them. And he said that he believed it was legal because he had a prescription for it. This would have been even after they became illegal. He thought they were legal because he had a prescription. He also said Vince McMahon never ordered him to take steroids and never purchased any steroids for him.